Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about one of the least glamorous sides of ancient Rome, prostitution. Rome loved to paint itself as the empire of marble temples, stoic philosophers, and victorious generals. But the truth? Thousands of women survived each day in cramped, filthy brothels, working themselves to the bone in ways history usually glosses over. Kind of wild how an empire so obsessed with order and law built a whole shadow economy on something this dirty, right? Oh, and if you're enjoying these journeys back in time, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe, but only if this is your thing. And I'm always curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. Always blows my mind seeing how many of you are drifting off to sleep from different corners of the world. All right, get cozy, find that blanket, adjust your pillows, let yourself settle. Take a slow, deep breath. Because where we're going, you're not a senator in a toga or a patrician at a banquet. You're just another body in the Subura district, Rome's overcrowded slum. And trust me, after tonight, you're going to be grateful for the bed you're lying in right now. So, congratulations, you just woke up in a Roman brothel sometime around the 1st century AD. The street outside stinks of garbage and chamber pots. The walls around you drip with damp, and the straw mattress under your back crawls with fleas. Rome may be the eternal city, but this morning, eternity looks a lot like a dirty cell with a curtain for a door. And your day is only just beginning. The brothel is already alive with sound. A rooster crows somewhere in the alley, but its cries drowned out by the clatter of sandals on the stone. Men are waking in their tenements, dragging water from wells, shouting at donkeys and children. In here, the first women are stirring too. They roll off their pallets, brushing lice from their hair, pulling rumpled tunics over tired shoulders. A brazier still smoulders faintly from last night, and the air is thick with the mingled stench of sweat, smoke, wine, and incense. The walls around you are close and wet to the touch. The stone has absorbed years of breath and moisture. They're not clean, never clean. Graffiti scratches its way across the plaster. Names of prostitutes, crude drawings, jokes about who was the cheapest, who was the roughest. It's not flattering, it's not kind, but it's Rome, and Rome's memory is carved here in vulgar little letters. This isn't the Rome of marble forums and triumphal arches. This is the Rome that starts with men pushing open the brothel door at dawn, tossing coins down for a quick encounter before heading to market. They don't linger, they don't ask names. It's business, fast and dirty. And every woman here knows what she's worth, not in dignity, not in respect, but in denarii, the small silver coins that will be divided later by the brothel keeper. Those coins will buy stale bread and sour wine, maybe olives if the night was good. There are no silks here, no gold bracelets, only enough to keep breathing. Imagine lying there, hearing the footsteps approach, knowing that the curtain across your cell isn't a door. It's just a pause before someone else enters. No lock, no privacy, just work. You adjust your tunic, rub a little soot under your eyes to look more alive, and wait for the day to really begin. Outside, the Subura hums with life. Vendors set up stalls, hawking fish that smell of yesterday's rot. Smoke curls from bakeries filling the air with the bitter scent of burned flour. Children splash in puddles that double as open sewers. And through it all, men drift toward the wolf's dens, where the city's poorest women will sell what little they have left to survive another day. That is Rome too. And for prostitutes in this world, survival starts the second they open their eyes. If you woke up in a Roman brothel, you didn't roll over and snooze. There was no soft bedding, no second blanket to pull over your head, no time to pretend the world could wait. The day started as soon as the streets outside began to hum, because the men were coming. And before that curtain was pushed aside, you had to do what passed for getting ready. Water was the first problem. Rome had aqueducts, sure, but not for you. The lupanar didn't have fountains or private baths. Prostitutes hauled water in clay jugs from the nearest public fountain, or begged the brothel keeper for a bucket. And water was precious, not because it was rare, but because it was heavy to carry and quick to spoil. So washing meant the bare minimum. A splash across the face, a rag rubbed down the arms and chest, maybe a trickle over hair that already smelled of sweat and smoke. If you were lucky, you had a strigil, the curved bronze scraper Romans used after rubbing themselves with oil. In fancy bath houses, wealthy women made this a luxury ritual. In a brothel it was desperate. A quick smear of cheap olive oil, then scrape the dirt, the sweat, the stench into a bucket. It didn't remove the fleas, it didn't erase the smell, but it gave the illusion of care. And illusion was everything. Next came paint. A prostitute's face was her signboard, and Rome was obsessed with appearances. Powder to pale the skin was common. Chalk or worse, white lead ground into dust. Everyone knew it poisoned slowly, but it also gave the face that pale, elite look men associated with delicacy. Rouge for the cheeks came from crushed berries or wine dregs, smeared with a finger until the skin glowed. Soot was rubbed around the eyes to make them larger, darker. If you could afford it, a dab of saffron or even crocodile dung was used as mascara. Yes, dung. Perfume was a gamble. Real perfume cost fortunes. What prostitutes used were oils mixed with herbs or flowers, sometimes rancid, sometimes cloying. They dabbed it on wrists, neck, hair. Did it hide the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies and smoke? Not really. But again, it created the illusion of effort. Enough for a client to believe he was stepping into fantasy instead of filth. Clothes were simple. A short tunic, often dyed a cheap, gaudy colour to catch the eye. Yellow was common, so common that the colour became associated with sex work. Some wore wigs, garish red or blonde, imported from captured Gauls or Germans, a way of saying exotic. Wigs hid lice, and they hid the shame of thinning hair. A prostitute would set hers crooked on her head and smile like it was intentional. And then there was the body. No modern hygiene products, no medicine, no relief from the cycles that kept coming. Linen rags washed in cold water and reused until they fell apart, served for menstruation. Herbal rinses were used to freshen before clients arrived. Some brothels kept jars of vinegar or wine for women to rinse themselves quickly. Crude, painful, often ineffective. But in a business where reputation mattered, you did what you had to. By the time the first footsteps echoed down the corridor, the women were ready. Painted faces, perfumed wrists, tunics straightened, hair combed back. They smiled like the mattress wasn't alive with fleas, like the chamber pot in the corner wasn't full, like the day ahead wouldn't grind them into exhaustion. This was survival, disguised as routine. Every dab of rouge, every stroke of soot, every splash of vinegar was a mask. Because in Rome, prostitutes weren't allowed dignity. They were only allowed illusion. The first men through the brothel door weren't senators or poets. They were the ones who worked with their hands. Soldiers who hadn't seen a woman in weeks. Farmers who sold their produce at dawn markets. Labourers who needed relief before hauling bricks all day. These men came early, came fast and came cheap. And for the women that meant no time to ease into the day, A prostitute might have only minutes between waking and pulling the curtain aside for the first client. He didn't come for conversation. He didn't come to flirt. He came to drop a coin and take what he wanted. A denarius if she was lucky, an as, a bronze coin worth almost nothing, if he was stingy. Some tried to haggle, some didn't even ask. They just shoved the money into her hand and pushed past. The soldiers were the roughest. Young men, full of arrogance, trained to kill but not to care. They came smelling of sweat and iron, sometimes still carrying their weapons. They treated the brothel as another barracks, loud, joking, boasting in Latin dialects from all over the empire. They mocked the women, mocked each other, carved graffiti into the walls about who lasted longest. The women endured, because soldiers brought steady business. The army was Rome's backbone, and its men poured wages into the wolf dens. Farmers were different. They came from outside the city, bringing mud on their sandals, smelling of animals and earth. They had little money, so they bargained hard. Sometimes they offered food instead of coins. A handful of olives, a loaf of bread. Brothel keepers often accepted. Women couldn't eat silver, but they could chew stale crusts. A prostitute might hate the farmer's rough hands, but she'd keep the bread hidden away for later, when hunger clawed at her belly. Labourers, porters, brickmakers, builders came next. They needed strength for the day, but also a moment of escape before the grind. Their calloused hands and cracked nails were reminders of how cheap life was in Rome. They didn't linger. For them, it was a transaction as blunt as hauling stone. Pay, use, leave. The rooms were tiny, barely wide enough to stretch out. Curtains flapped open and shut as men filed in. Coins clinked against rough wooden counters where the brothel keeper sat, eyes sharp for cheats. The air grew thick within minutes. Sweat, incense, sour wine, and the sound of bodies behind fabric walls. It wasn't passion, it wasn't romance, it was business, brutal and quick. And there were rules. Prostitutes had no right to refuse. They were property of the brothel keeper, bound by debt or chains of poverty. A woman who resisted risked beatings, or worse, starvation. Rome legalised prostitution, but it legalised it for men, not for women. The law branded them as infames, people without honour, lumped together with actors and gladiators. Once registered as a prostitute, you could never escape the stigma. Even if you married, even if you somehow clawed your way out, society always knew what you had been. Imagine the weight of that. As the first man of the morning pulled the curtain aside, he didn't see you as a neighbour, a citizen, a woman. He saw a body he had bought. You smiled anyway, because not smiling might cost more than you could afford. By mid-morning the first wave was done. The women were already exhausted, faces smeared, hair tangled again, tunics wrinkled. The coins clinked in the brothel keeper's pouch, but only a fraction would ever end up in their hands. And still, the day stretched ahead. More clients, more coins, more hours in the wolf's den. This was Rome's underbelly, the part the marble statues never show. And for prostitutes, the morning rush was only the beginning. By the time the morning crowd thinned, the clink of coins echoed louder than any sighs or laughter. Because in Rome, prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was taxed, regulated, and milked by the state for profit. Every groan behind a curtain meant not only survival for the woman, but revenue for the empire. Let's talk money. A single session might cost an as, the cheapest Roman coin, no more than the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of sour wine. Some women charged more, a denarius silver instead of bronze if they were young, exotic, or working in a high-class establishment. But in the Subura, where the air was thick with smoke and sewage, It was usually copper coins exchanged for sweat. Here's the brutal truth. Those coins didn't stay in the women's hands. Most prostitutes worked under a brothel keeper, the lino or lena, who took the lion's share. The women got scraps, enough to buy bread, maybe lamp oil, maybe a rag for clothing, but never enough to escape. The keeper kept them in debt, charging for food, for a pallet to sleep on, for the tunics they wore. Every coin earned went right back into the brothel's pocket. It was a cycle designed to trap. And then came the state. Emperor Caligula, infamous for his cruelty, imposed a lex vectigalis, a direct tax on prostitution. Every woman had to register officially as a prostitute, her name written down in civic records for life. She paid taxes like a tradesperson, as if selling her body was no different than selling pots or sandals. That meant inspectors could show up at brothels, counting heads, ensuring every woman was recorded, every coin accounted for. The shame wasn't private, it was public. To Rome, prostitutes were infames, stripped of honour, barred from testifying in court, cut off from basic legal rights. And yet, Rome needed them, desperately. Prostitution was seen as a safety valve for society. Better men spend their lust in brothels, lawmakers argued, than dishonour respectable matrons. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same senators who sneered at prostitutes during the day often slipped into lupanars at night. And all the while, the state kept its hand out, ready to collect its cut. The economics were harshest for streetwalkers. These women couldn't even afford to rent space inside a brothel. They worked alleys, corners, stairwells. They wore the infamous yellow cloak, the toga mulibris, marking them as prostitutes, visible to all. They charged pennies, often less than the price of a meal, and lived in constant danger, robbed by clients, beaten by passers-by, preyed upon by pimps. Yet even they were expected to pay taxes, even if it meant handing over nearly everything they earned. Some women tried to climb higher. Courtesans, meretrices honestae, could charge more, offering conversation, music, and wit along with sex. They catered to wealthier men, sometimes securing long-term patrons. But even here, survival was precarious. A courtesan might live in silks one year and starve the next if her patron grew bored or went bankrupt. And the price of ambition was branding. Once registered, always registered. Even if a woman saved enough to escape the trade, society never let her forget. Her name was etched into the rolls of prostitutes, permanent, eternal. A Roman matron could wash her hands in perfumed water and attend temples. A former prostitute, no matter how wealthy or reformed, would never escape the stench of that word, infamis. Imagine handing over coins at the end of a brutal day, watching your keeper count them, your stomach gnawing with hunger. You know most won't come back to you. Then hearing the knock at the door, the tax collector, smiling, demanding his cut. You bite your lip, hand it over, and remind yourself that at least you're still alive, for now. Because in Rome, even misery had a price, and the empire always got paid. If you picture a Roman brothel, don't just think of women behind curtains. Think of one figure sitting at the centre of it all, the brothel keeper. Known as the leno if a man, or lena if a woman, this person controlled every breath the prostitutes took. The keeper was gatekeeper, landlord, banker, and jailer rolled into one. Most brothel keepers weren't glamorous criminals in silk togas. They were hustlers, parasites who found profit in misery. Some were freed slaves who had learned the trade the hard way. Others were businessmen who saw prostitution as a sure bet. A few were women, ex-prostitutes themselves, who had clawed their way out of service only to chain others in their place. Their business model was simple: Own the space, rent out the bodies, keep the profit. The keeper supplied food, bedding, cheap tunics, and even cosmetics, all at inflated prices. Every prostitute's wage was siphoned off to pay these debts. A woman might hand over her coins at the end of the day, only to be told she owed more for the bread she ate, the lamp oil she burned, the makeup she smeared on her face. The balance never tipped in her favour, and there was punishment. A woman who refused a client, who didn't smile enough, who talked back, could be beaten. Rome's laws offered prostitutes no protection. If a keeper struck them, starved them, even sold them onward to another brothel, no one intervened. To the state, prostitutes were in flames beneath the law. A keeper might chain women in cell-like rooms, especially if they had tried to escape. Others enforced control with humiliation, shaving heads, forcing women to stand outside in yellow cloaks, branding them as property. But here's the paradox. The brothel keeper was also the only shield. A prostitute working the streets alone was prey for thieves, soldiers, even random mobs. Inside a brothel, the keeper at least provided walls, a curtain, a locked door at night. In return, the keeper demanded loyalty, or at least obedience. Some women clung to that thin layer of protection, even when it came wrapped in cruelty. Corruption was part of the game. Keepers bribed tax collectors to look the other way, bribed local guards to ignore fights or deaths inside. They might host special clients, senators, equestrians, merchants, offering the best women, finest wine, better rooms. Those nights, a prostitute might glimpse the luxury of another world. Silk cushions, hot meals, warm baths. But the illusion vanished by morning, when she returned to her straw mattress and her debt ledger. There were also rumours whispered in the Subura. Some keepers trafficked in more than sex. They acted as informants, passing gossip to powerful patrons. Who visited whom? What secrets slipped out during drunken confessions? These tidbits became currency. A leaner could ruin a senator by leaking his habits, or blackmail a merchant into paying double for silence. In this way, the brothel keeper wielded a power that reached far beyond the curtain. Still, the image carved deepest into daily life wasn't power. It was pettiness. The keeper counting coins with greedy fingers, weighing every as, every denarius, reminding each woman that her body wasn't hers. It belonged to the house, to the ledger, to the endless cycle of debt. Imagine handing over the few coins you've scraped together after hours of work. Your back aching, your makeup smeared. The keeper sneers, notes your debt in wax tablets, and reminds you that tomorrow you'll owe even more. You can't win. You can only endure. And in Rome, endurance was the currency that kept the brothel running. When most people imagine the men who haunted Rome's brothels, they picture soldiers, dock workers, or dusty farmers fresh from the fields. But the reality was far uglier, and in some ways far more absurd. The men who thundered against vice in the forum were often the same men dropping coins on a brothel counter at night. Priests came first, cloaked in piety by day, cloaked in shadows by night. Rome was a city obsessed with religion, and its priests were supposed to embody sacred order. But temple duty didn't erase lust. Some slipped into the Subura after rituals, still smelling of incense and sacrifices, their hands stained with ox blood. They justified it as keeping balance, spending their seed in a place designed for lust, so their homes stayed pure. Hypocrisy, wrapped in ritual. Senators and equestrians were next. These men had villas, wives, mistresses, slaves, yet still prowled the lupanars. Why? Because brothels offered something their polished villas did not: anonymity, and degradation. In their own homes, they had to play the role of dignified Roman patriarchs. In the Subura, they could shed that mask, drink cheap wine, pay a coin, and do things no matron or mistress would ever tolerate. It was about control, not pleasure, about walking into a room where every woman was beneath them by law. Branded infames, stripped of honour, senators liked to remind themselves of power, even in bed. And here's the dirty secret. The walls of Pompeii prove it. Graffiti scratched by customers boast of who slept with whom, which women were worth the coin, which senators were seen sneaking through the alleys. Roman society pretended these liaisons never happened, but the city's walls tattled on everyone. Even women came. Wealthy matrons, cloaked and veiled, entered lupanars looking for what their arranged marriages lacked. Roman marriages were contracts, not romances. Wives were often much younger than their husbands, treated as property, denied affection. Some sought out prostitutes, both male and female, to find pleasure outside the villa's suffocating rules. It was risky. If caught, a matron faced ruin, divorce, even exile. But a few took the risk anyway, vanishing into the Subura's shadows when desire outweighed fear. Then there were clients history barely mentions, slave owners sending their slaves into brothels as customers, young men brought by fathers to make them men, travellers from distant provinces lured by Rome's reputation for indulgence. The brothel was a crossroads, and anyone could step inside. What united them all was secrecy. A senator wouldn't admit to sharing the same woman as a dockhand. A priest wouldn't boast about smelling of incense and sweat. These men lived double lives, their reputations gleaming by day, their lust satisfied by night. And the women? They bore the brunt of it, forced to smile, to act as if every client was just another coin in the pouch, even when the man behind the curtain was someone who had voted to raise their taxes that morning. Imagine lying on a straw mattress as a senator in silk robes slips into the room, the same man who thundered in the forum about virtue and honour. Imagine knowing you'll be the secret he'll never speak of, the shadow he'll bury under wine and politics. For him, it's a game. For you, it's survival. Rome pretended its brothels were hidden, but in truth, they were woven into the empire's fabric. Its most powerful men kept them alive, while pretending they didn't exist. Rome's streets were loud, filthy, and alive at every hour. Market stalls shouted prices, beggars rattled cups, and street performers juggled knives or sang bawdy songs. But layered over this noise was another kind of commerce, the selling of bodies. And the advertising? Cruder, stranger, and more public than you might expect. Start with graffiti. In Pompeii, the walls of brothels and taverns are still etched with carved messages. Some read like Yelp reviews 2,000 years too early. Marcelina, worth every coin. Onesimus gives good service. Others mocked rivals, boasting that so-and-so exhausted me in minutes, or try the girl on the corner, cheaper and better. These weren't whispers in alleyways. They were scratched into stone, preserved for anyone walking by. Imagine passing the wall of your apartment and seeing your name and profession carved there forever. For prostitutes, there was no hiding. Then there were the signs. Brothels sometimes painted explicit frescoes above their doors. Not subtle symbols, but graphic pictures of acts, almost like a menu. A weary traveller could simply glance up, see what was on offer, and decide if the price was worth it. Archaeologists in Pompeii found a lupanar with walls covered in painted options, each act illustrated in bold strokes. It wasn't art, it was advertising. Streetwalkers had their own methods. They wore the toga muliebri, a yellowish cloak or tunic, marking them instantly as prostitutes. It was a kind of uniform enforced by law. If you saw a woman in one, you knew exactly what she was selling. No modest veils, no matronly stolers, just a flash of colour that branded them day and night. Some even jingled small bells to catch attention, competing with vendors' cries, hoping to draw eyes and coins their way. Competition was brutal. Rome had thousands of prostitutes, from the Subura slums to the shadow of the Forum itself. Women leaned from upper windows, calling down to passers-by. They lingered at bathhouse entrances, waiting for flushed men exiting the steam. They prowled taverns, offering themselves alongside to cheap wine. And always there was undercutting. A woman might drop her price from 2 asses to 1 if another called out first. Some promised special services, carving their claims into walls. I please all who enter. I never refuse. Cheaper here. Even brothels competed. Keepers tried to outdo each other with gimmicks. Free wine with entry, better mattresses, more exotic women. Some even staged mock theatre at the entrance. Women dancing or posing provocatively in doorways to lure crowds. The competition wasn't for long-term loyalty. It was for immediate attention. With so many bodies for sale, you had to make yourself impossible to ignore. But there was a darker edge. Rivals sometimes sabotaged each other. A prostitute might spread rumours that another had disease or that her services were disappointing. Keepers sent men to rough up competitors, to smash their signs, to carve insults into their walls. It wasn't just about survival, it was war, fought with whispers, fists and knives. And through it all, the city didn't blink. Graffiti covered public buildings. Prostitutes stood openly in streets, advertising their trade as blatantly as fruit sellers. The hypocrisy was staggering. Senators condemned prostitution in speeches, then passed by frescoes of brothel menus on their way home. Respectable matrons clutched their veils tighter, pretending not to hear the shouted offers echoing from taverns. But everyone knew. Everyone saw. Picture yourself walking down a crowded Roman street. To your left, vendors shout about olives and bread. To your right, a woman in a yellow cloak calls out, jingling a bell, offering herself for a single coin. Above her, a fresco shows exactly what's inside, painted for all to see. And behind you, someone scratching into the wall. Lucius was here. The girl upstairs is cheap. That's the Roman marketplace of bodies, noisy, competitive, impossible to ignore. For the women inside it, advertising wasn't a choice. It was survival. If you could step inside a Roman brothel, the first thing that would strike you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Forget the glossy Hollywood version with perfumed oils and candlelit beds. A lupanar reeked. The air was thick with sweat, smoke from oil lamps, stale wine, rotting food scraps, and something far worse, the sharp tang of unwashed bodies crammed together, day and night. Hygiene was primitive at best. Prostitutes rarely had the luxury of bathing daily. Soap as we know it didn't exist. Instead, they scraped their skin with strigils, maybe rubbed on olive oil to mask odours. But in cramped brothels with no ventilation, no running water, and only chamber pots for waste, smells built up fast. Imagine a room the size of a closet. A straw mattress soaked through, curtains pulled across a doorway to keep the street out. Every day, dozens of bodies cycled in and out of that same bed. There was no laundry service, no fresh linens, only sweat, stains, and the lingering odour of every man who had come before. And then came disease. Rome had no concept of germs. No one understood how infections spread. Prostitutes faced constant exposure to what Romans bluntly called venereal sores. Syphilis wouldn't arrive in Europe until the 15th century, but gonorrhea and chlamydia likely circulated freely. Ancient medical texts describe discharges, burning pains, ulcers and rashes, conditions treated with vinegar washes, lead ointments, or herbal fumigations that did little more than irritate further. A woman suffering couldn't simply rest. She was expected to keep working, sick or not, because her debt to the brothel keeper never paused. Parasites added another layer of misery. Lice thrived in the unwashed bedding, fleas bit at ankles, worms infested guts, spreading through contaminated water and food. Even the cosmetics they used carried risks. Lead-based face powders poisoned the skin, and coal eyeliner sometimes caused infections. For prostitutes, beauty and disease went hand in hand. The stench extended beyond brothel walls. Streets outside often doubled as open sewers, chamber pots emptied directly into the gutters. Waste mixed with rainwater, flowing past taverns, shops, and yes, lupanars. Imagine walking into a brothel where the floor is damp, not with spilled wine, but with sewage trickling from the alley. And yet clients came, shrugging off the filth because pleasure was cheap and shame was cheaper. The smell became a kind of weapon. Writers sneered about it in moralistic texts. Prostitutes could be identified, they said, not by their clothes, but by the reek of their trade. Satirists joked that the women carried the stench of fish markets or goat stalls, clinging to them wherever they went. But behind the cruel humour was a darker truth. These women had no choice. They were forced to work in spaces no more sanitary than a stable. Even the health care inside brothels was filthy. Midwives sometimes doubled as healers, offering herbal remedies or fumigations with burning herbs meant to cleanse the womb. Some women inserted pessaries made of wool soaked in honey, vinegar, or even mercury compounds. The intention was protection from pregnancy, from disease. In reality, it often made things worse. Infection was common, burns and scarring too. The brothel keeper didn't care. As long as a woman could stand, she was sent back to work. Close your eyes and picture it. A room lit by one smoky lamp, a mattress crawling with lice, the walls sweating with damp. Outside, sewage trickles by. Inside, a woman forces a smile, her body aching, her skin marked by rashes and sores. The man doesn't notice or doesn't care. He tosses a coin and leaves. She exhales into the stench, knowing another body will press through the curtain in minutes. Rome called itself the centre of civilization, but in its brothels, civilization smelled like decay. In a world without latex, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of reproduction, prostitutes in ancient Rome lived every day under the shadow of pregnancy. For them, children weren't blessings. They were liabilities, mouths they couldn't feed, proof of encounters no one wanted acknowledged, and often instant death sentences for both mother and infant. So women turned to remedies, tricks, and outright poisons in a desperate attempt to keep control of their own bodies. Some were simple. The most common method was the pessary, little wads of wool soaked in substances meant to block or kill seed. Vinegar was popular, its acidity thought to close the womb. Honey was another, sticky and symbolic of purity, though hardly effective. Olive oil, cedar resin, or even animal dung sometimes coated the wool. These were inserted before sex, uncomfortable, unreliable, but better than nothing. Then there was silphium. This plant, harvested only in North Africa, was so famous as a contraceptive and abortifacient that its image appeared on coins. Prostitutes, especially those with wealthier clients, sought it like gold, A small dose was believed to prevent pregnancy. A larger one could trigger abortion. But silphium was over-harvested and went extinct in the 1st century AD. By then, women were left with less effective herbs. Rue, pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace. They worked sometimes, but they also poisoned, burned, or killed the woman using them. Abortion, when prevention failed, was brutal. Midwives offered concoctions of wine mixed with crushed copper or lead filings. Women were told to jump, to lift heavy objects, to drink dangerous brews until their bodies expelled the fetus. Some remedies involved fumigations, squatting over burning herbs like asafoetida or pitch, letting smoke fill the womb. Desperate measures for desperate women. The medical writers of Rome, men like Serranus or Galen, documented some of these methods in matter-of-fact tones, but their clinical detachment hides the raw suffering of the women who endured them. Imagine crouching in a smoky room, inhaling fumes until your head spins, praying that the herbs inside you will work before your keeper notices. Imagine drinking a cup of pennyroyal tea, so bitter it makes you retch. Knowing too much might stop your heart. There were other tricks too. Some women used magic, or what Romans called magic, amulets of bronze phalluses, charms inscribed with nonsense words, prayers whispered to Venus or Diana. A woman might wear a stone tied with red thread, hoping it would protect her from conception. Others smeared strange brews on their skin, mixtures of animal fat and herbs, thinking it would form a barrier. These rituals rarely worked, but they gave women something vital, a sense of agency in a life where they had none. And when all else failed, infanticide. Harsh, yes, but brutally common. A baby born to a prostitute was rarely kept. The child might be abandoned at the city's expositio sites, left on a hillside or at the dump. Sometimes they were taken in by others, raised as slaves or future prostitutes. Sometimes they simply died where they were left. Rome's moralists railed against such cruelty, yet turned a blind eye to the conditions that made it inevitable. The irony is that men knew these practices were happening and sometimes encouraged them. Brothel keepers didn't want their women pregnant. A pregnant prostitute was useless. Wealthy clients didn't want scandalous offspring, and so remedies were passed down, whispered from one woman to another, hidden in the shadows of Rome's great marble city. Picture the scene. A prostitute crouched in her small room, woolen pessary in hand, dipping it into vinegar as voices echo in the street outside. She knows it's a flimsy shield, but she has no choice. Her life depends on it. Rome's empire might stretch across the world, but her empire is her own body, and it's one she's fighting to defend with herbs, smoke, and desperation. Rome called them meretrices. They called themselves survivors. If the filth and disease didn't break a prostitute in Rome, the violence often did. Working in a lupanar wasn't just exhausting, it was dangerous, every hour of every day. Violence was so normal that Roman law barely acknowledged it. Prostitutes existed in a legal twilight, without the protections given to respectable women. If a wife was beaten by her husband, at least in theory, she could appeal to her family or the courts. If a prostitute was beaten by a client, she was on her own. Clients often treated prostitutes like objects, not people. A man could slap, punch, or worse, and she had little recourse. Some captors even encouraged roughness, whispering to clients that the women could take it. After all, damaged bodies could still earn coin as long as they could move. The insults were constant too. Roman society saw prostitutes as the lowest of the low. Public women, whose bodies were communal property. Satirists called them pigs, donkeys, garbage. Men insulted them mid-act, laughed at their pain, mocked their desperation. This humiliation was part of the service, a twisted way of reinforcing dominance. And the worst part? It was expected. If a prostitute dared to protest, she risked losing what little protection her keeper offered, or worse, being thrown into the street. Then there was violence from the keepers themselves. Pimps controlled their women through debt and fists. Many prostitutes began their lives in bondage, slaves sold into sex by owners looking to profit. Even freed women often found themselves trapped in cycles of debt they could never escape. Brothel keepers beat women who didn't earn enough, starved them as punishment, or confined them in rooms until they learned obedience. Some were even branded, literally burned with marks on their skin, to show ownership. Once branded, escape was nearly impossible. Outside the brothel, the danger didn't lessen. Streetwalkers risked robbery or rape at any moment. Rome's alleys were dark and lawless after sundown. Bands of drunk men roamed, mocking or harassing women. Guards might intervene, or might join in. Prostitutes were seen as fair game, bodies without rights, prey for anyone who wanted them. And yet, the cruelty didn't end with physical blows. There was the constant threat of exposure. A respectable Roman man might frequent brothels but despise the idea of being seen there. If a prostitute mentioned his name, hinted at his preferences, or worse, demanded payment publicly, she risked brutal retribution. Sometimes prostitutes were silenced permanently. Rome's sewers and rivers held more secrets than anyone admitted. Even among themselves, women weren't safe. Competition bred jealousy, and jealousy bred violence. Rival prostitutes fought for clients with fists, knives, and poisoned drinks. Archaeologists have found curse tablets, buried near brothels, inscribed with pleas to the gods to cripple or kill a rival. Imagine a woman whispering to Hecate under the moon, burying a wax doll pierced with needles, begging for her competitor to lose her voice or her beauty. This wasn't theatre, it was survival. And yet, through all this, prostitutes endured. Some even carved out slivers of control, using wit, manipulation, or alliances with powerful clients to shield themselves. A lucky few became mistresses, escaping the brothel walls, but most lived with the daily knowledge that the next man through the curtain might not just take his pleasure, he might take everything. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the sound of sandals slapping the stones outside and the curtain rustling as a man steps into your tiny room. You don't know if he's gentle or cruel, if he's carrying coin or a fist. You smile anyway. Because in Rome, survival meant hiding your fear and hoping that tonight the violence stopped short of killing you. Rome loved to call itself the pinnacle of civilization, the empire of law and virtue. Yet when it came to sex, hypocrisy dripped from every marble column. Men could indulge almost anywhere, almost any time, and walk away untouched. Women, especially prostitutes, carried every ounce of the blame. The contradiction was stark. On one hand, Roman law and moralists thundered against immorality. Marriage was sacred, they said. Women must be pure, chaste, silent. On the other hand, the same men preaching those virtues thought nothing of visiting brothels, taverns, or street corners. A Roman man's appetite was considered natural, even healthy. To deny it would have been odd. Prostitutes existed, in the words of one writer, to protect respectable wives from their husbands' desires. In other words, women in brothels were a pressure valve, human shields against male lust spilling into polite society. Respectable women had no such outlet. A Roman matron who dared step outside her role risked everything: divorce, disgrace, exile. If she was accused of adultery, the penalties were severe, sometimes even death. Meanwhile, her husband could take his pleasure with a prostitute, a slave, even another man, and suffer no consequences. Adultery laws applied only to women. Men were exempt by definition. The hypocrisy was baked into daily life. Wealthy senators lectured on virtue in the Senate, while secretly owning slaves they used for sex. Generals paraded their families in public, but were whispered about for keeping whole harems of prostitutes on campaign. Even emperors set the tone. Caligula flaunted his affairs with prostitutes, sometimes bringing them into banquets as entertainment. Augustus, who passed strict laws on female chastity, was notorious for his private indulgences. Everyone knew, but everyone looked the other way. Prostitutes bore the brunt of this double life. They were simultaneously desired and despised. Men could not live without them, but they also mocked them, shamed them, and excluded them from society. They were essential, yet disposable. That tension hung over every transaction, every coin tossed on a mattress, and the cruelty went deeper. The stigma attached to prostitutes followed them forever. A man could visit a lupanar in his youth, marry a noblewoman later, and still rise to high office. No one would care. A woman who had worked in a brothel, even if forced there as a slave, carried that mark until death. Freed from slavery, still a prostitute in the eyes of society. Married, still whispered about as spoiled. Children, tainted by their mother's past. Respectability was gone, irretrievable. Even the law codified the divide. Prostitutes had to register with officials, their names written in ledgers as if branded on their skin. Men's names, of course, were never recorded. A man could visit brothels his whole life without leaving a single legal trace, but a woman had to live with the eternal paper trail of her shame. Think about the bitterness of that world. Men strutted through forums boasting of conquest, both military and sexual. Their statues lined the streets. Their wives and daughters were praised as paragons of virtue. And yet in the shadows, the system that made it all possible was fueled by women whose names history refused to remember. For prostitutes, the message was clear. Your body was Rome's convenience, your shame Rome's shield. You carried the weight so men could walk free. That was the real double standard, and it crushed women for centuries. Most prostitutes in Rome lived and died nameless. Their lives dissolved into the gutters and ash heaps without a single line in history. But every now and then, one woman's story was too outrageous, too scandalous, or too powerful to be ignored. These names flicker through the records, glimpses of women who managed to bend Rome's hypocrisy back on itself. One of the most infamous was Volumnia Cytheris, often simply called Cytheris. She began her life as a freedwoman, trained as a mime actress, a profession already scandalous, since mimes were associated with bawdy humour, nudity, and sexual availability. Cytheris became the lover of none other than Marcus Antonius. Yes, the same Mark Antony, who later ruled Rome alongside Cleopatra. For a time, Antony flaunted her openly, parading her in a chariot across the city. Imagine the scandal. A general of Rome showing off a former prostitute like a trophy. Cicero, ever the moralist, foamed with disgust in his letters, mocking Antony for allowing himself to be ruled by a whore. Yet Cytheris endured. She carved her name into history simply by being seen. Then there was Faustina, a courtesan whose story is mostly rumour, whispered in satirical poems. Said to be entangled with high-ranking senators, Faustina became notorious not just for her beauty, but for her wit. Writers described her humiliating clients with sharp words, reducing Rome's powerful men to blushing boys. In a society where prostitutes were supposed to be silent, Faustina's tongue was her weapon. Every insult she delivered was a scandal, every joke a small rebellion. And then there was Scylla, whose name appears in graffiti scrawled on the walls of Pompeii. Scylla for 2 asses. That was the going rate, etched forever in stone. We don't know her face, her story, or her fate, but her name survives, defying the silence. In that sense, she is as famous as any general, carved into history by the hand of a drunk Roman scratching a wall. Even emperors couldn't resist scandal. Caligula, infamous for his cruelty and excess, allegedly turned sections of his palace into a brothel. Senators' wives and noblewomen were reportedly forced to work as prostitutes, a grotesque reversal of Rome's social order. Clients were invited to wander marble halls and choose among the unwilling entertainers. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories horrified Rome's moralists, not because women were being exploited, but because the lines between respectable and prostitute had been blurred. Later, the Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, became the centre of another scandal. Ancient writers accused her of sneaking out of the palace at night to work under an alias in Roman brothels, competing with prostitutes to see who could service the most clients in a single night. Whether true or not, the story stuck, repeated gleefully by satirists who despised her ambition and power. For Romans, the idea that the empress herself could be lower than the lowest was both horrifying and thrilling. These women, whether real or twisted by rumour, reveal something raw about Rome. Our prostitutes were supposed to be invisible, their labour hidden behind curtains, their names unspoken. Yet when one rose too high, or a rumour escaped, the whole city buzzed with scandal. Writers sneered, moralists fumed, and yet the names remain. In a way, their survival is its own rebellion. Cytheris, Faustina, Scylla, Messalina, they remind us that even in a society designed to erase them, prostitutes forced their way into history's pages. And maybe that's the greatest scandal of all. Rome could use them, despise them, mock them, but Rome could not forget them. Rome's brothels weren't just sweaty rooms and straw mats. They were businesses, ruthless, efficient, and built on the broken backs of women. Behind every curtain and creaking bed was an economy, and it was one that chewed women up and spat them out. Let's start with the money. A cheap street prostitute might cost as little as 2 asses, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. Brothel women, depending on their looks, experience or novelty, charged more. A few sesterces here, a denarius there. The price might seem small today, but for Rome's poor, even a single coin meant sacrifice. That was the cruel genius of the system, cheap enough for every man to afford, lucrative enough to keep women enslaved, and the pimps knew exactly what they were doing. Many prostitutes never saw their earnings. If they were slaves, every coin went directly to their owner. If they were freed women, they were often bound by crushing debts for rent, food, clothes, even the lamp oil that lit their rooms. The brothel keeper kept careful records. A prostitute might technically earn a denarius a night, but after deductions she owed more than she made. It was a hamster wheel of exploitation. The harder she worked, the deeper she sank. Debt wasn't just financial, it was legal. Once a woman registered as a prostitute, the stigma followed her forever. There was no early retirement. The record was permanent, binding her to the lowest rung of society. Even if she paid her way out of debt, society never forgot. Respectability was a currency she could never buy back. The business side of brothels was remarkably organised. Archaeologists in Pompeii discovered paintings of services with prices displayed right on the walls, like a menu. A client could stroll in, glance at the frescoes, and make his choice. Some brothels even offered specials, lowering prices during festivals when demand was high. It was consumer culture at its grittiest. Prostitutes themselves were often advertised like products. Graffiti scrawled names and prices across the city. Flora 2 asses, Daphne 5, leader worth every coin. Sometimes these were real ads, other times they were insults, mocking women by branding them publicly. Either way, the economy thrived on women's bodies as commodities. Their names reduced to price tags. And it wasn't just the brothel keepers profiting. Tavern owners, bathhouse attendants, and innkeepers all took their cut. Sex and alcohol went hand in hand, with prostitutes stationed in taverns to lure in customers. Inns doubled as makeshift brothels, with prostitutes renting rooms by the hour. Even temples weren't immune. Rumours swirled of sacred prostitution tied to foreign cults. Though Roman writers probably exaggerated this as a way of smearing religions they disliked. The state profited too. Prostitutes were taxed, just like merchants and craftsmen. Rome's treasury happily collected coins from the very trade moralists condemned in public speeches. It was the ultimate double face. Prostitution was shameful, yet the state's coffers jingled with its earnings. For the women, it meant there was no escape. Every coin earned was another link in the chain. Every debt recorded was another nail in the coffin. The brothel wasn't just a place. It was an economy, a system designed to keep women working until their bodies gave out. Picture it. You're sitting in a dim stone room, the smell of oil lamps heavy in the air. You've worked all night, your hands trembling as you count the coins you were allowed to keep. Then your keeper appears, scratching marks onto his wax tablet, listing your debts. He takes back nearly everything. What's left won't even buy you dinner. Tomorrow you'll start again. Because in Rome, sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was about profit. If the brothel's debts didn't destroy a woman, disease almost certainly would. Roman prostitutes lived in constant contact with sickness, their bodies battered by infections, injuries and parasites. Medicine, such as it was, rarely offered help, and sometimes made things worse. The first threat was the simplest: lice, fleas and bed bugs. Straw mattresses were never changed, blankets rarely washed. Women spent nights scratching at their scalps and arms until their skin bled. But that was only the surface. Far worse came from the endless parade of clients. No one in Rome understood microbes, but everyone knew prostitutes carried a reputation for disease. Men joked about it, poets sneered about it. But for the women themselves, the pain was not a joke. Venereal infections were rampant. Ancient writers like Celsus described painful sores, strange discharges, and swelling in blunt clinical terms. Remedies ranged from harsh herbs to burning caustic ointments rubbed directly into the skin. Mercury compounds, sometimes used for treatment, poisoned as much as they healed. Imagine the agony. A woman already in pain, forced to smear corrosive paste on her body just to keep working the next night. There were no antibiotics, no real cures, just suffering layered onto shame. Pregnancy was another constant hazard. Contraceptives existed, mixtures of herbs like silphium, now extinct, pennyroyal, or even crocodile dung imported from Egypt. Some may have helped, most did not. Abortions were attempted with sharp tools, toxic brews, or brutal physical force. Many women died in the process. Others were left scarred, unable to bear children later. And still, pregnancy kept coming. A prostitute who carried a child to term faced more burdens. Her work interrupted, her body weakened, her child often sold or abandoned to survive. Brothel owners treated women as replaceable. If disease made one too weak, she was simply discarded. Some were sold off to the countryside, forced into field labour despite their frail health. Others ended up begging on the streets, marked by sores and thinner skeletons. To Rome, they were already ruined, both in flesh and reputation. Medical texts revealed chilling glimpses into this world. One recipe recommended grinding lead into wine as a contraceptive, poisoning the woman slowly over time. Another suggested fumigating the vagina with smoke from burned herbs, a practice as ineffective as it was painful. Prostitutes were test subjects for a medicine obsessed with theory and ritual, but indifferent to their lives. And then there was the ever-present stench. Infections often led to gangrene, pus and foul odours. Roman society despised prostitutes, partly for this reason, not just moral disgust but physical repulsion. Satirists mocked them as reekers, as if their suffering was somehow funny. Imagine carrying that weight. The world laughing at your disease while you coughed blood into a rag. Yet some women fought back with resilience. They developed their own remedies, poultices of honey, vinegar washes, or clay mixed with herbs. These home cures sometimes worked better than anything a physician prescribed. A prostitute's survival often depended on knowledge passed from woman to woman, whispered in the corners of brothels where no doctor ever cared to look. Still, the odds were stacked against them. Life expectancy was brutally short. Many prostitutes died in their 20s or early 30s, worn out by sickness and exploitation. Rome's streets saw them vanish daily, their bodies carted away without ceremony. Their absence was filled the next day by another woman, fresh and unknowing, ready to begin the same cycle. For all Rome's marble temples and grand philosophies, its eternal city was built on the backs of women whose lives were painfully finite. Their bodies kept men's pleasures alive, and in return, disease consumed them long before their time. Even if a Roman prostitute somehow survived disease, debts, and the daily grind of clients, one burden never left her: stigma. In the Roman world, a prostitute wasn't just someone who sold sex. She was permanently marked, stripped of honour, and excluded from the privileges of respectable life. And religion, law and culture all conspired to make sure that stain never washed away. Let's start with religion. Roman religion was practical, transactional. Offer the right sacrifice, say the right prayer, and the gods would favour you. Prostitutes were allowed to enter temples and make offerings like anyone else, but whispers followed them. Many cults, especially those tied to traditional family values, saw them as unclean. Priests condemned their presence at festivals, accusing them of polluting sacred rituals. Yet ironically, some foreign cults, like those of Isis or Kibbalah, became notorious for their association with sexuality. Roman writers sneered, suggesting prostitutes flocked to these temples. Was it true, or just another insult? Hard to say, but either way, the link between foreign gods and fallen women became a permanent stain in the Roman imagination. The law carved stigma even deeper. To work legally, a woman had to register as a meretrix with the city aedile. This wasn't just paperwork, it was a permanent confession, stamped into public record. Once registered, she could never change her legal status. No matter how much money she saved, no matter if she married, no matter if she left the trade, She remained, in the eyes of Rome, a prostitute. Her children bore the mark too, facing prejudice for a sin they never committed. Respectability was one of Rome's most valuable currencies, and prostitutes were denied it forever. Morality, meanwhile, was a game of hypocrisy. Elite men sneered at prostitutes in public speeches, calling them filth and dregs of society. Poets like Juvenal and Martial filled their verses with crude jokes at prostitutes' expense, mocking their smells, their voices, their aging bodies. But those same men visited brothels under cover of night, public shaming in the forum, private indulgence in the back alleys. It was the Roman way. For women, stigma shaped every part of daily life. A prostitute could not inherit wealth easily. She could not testify in court as a credible witness. She could not legally marry a senator or a knight. Even freed women who clawed their way into comfort through prostitution remained outside the circle of honour. Their homes might be filled with silks, perfumes and marble statues, but their neighbours still called them whores. Worse, stigma-fueled violence. Clients treated prostitutes brutally, knowing they had no legal recourse. If a man assaulted or cheated a prostitute, she had little chance of winning in court. Judges laughed off complaints, reminding her that she had chosen shame. Respectable women could expect at least some defence of their honour. Prostitutes had none. Their bodies were considered public property, their suffering invisible. Religion twisted the knife. Priests reminded prostitutes they were unclean, unsuitable for the sacred role of wife or mother. Funerary inscriptions rarely honoured them, and when they did, the tone was often bitter, describing them as faithful despite her trade, or a woman of shame. Imagine living your entire life knowing that even your gravestone would carry a sneer. And yet, stigma didn't erase them. Prostitutes were everywhere, in taverns, baths, temples and theatres. Rome's streets whispered their names, carved them into walls, and etched them into jokes. Society couldn't exist without them, but it also couldn't accept them. They were both indispensable and disposable. That was the cruelest truth of all. No matter how many coins passed through their hands, no matter how many men relied on them, prostitutes in Rome could never buy back respect. The stain was permanent. It wasn't just written in law or religion, it was burned into the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. By now you've walked through every corner of a prostitute's world in ancient Rome. The cramped brothels, the stinking taverns, the endless parade of men, the debts, the diseases, and the stigma that clung tighter than any garment. And what's left at the end of it all is a truth Rome itself rarely said out loud. These women were essential, yet treated as less than human. Prostitutes were everywhere. They lurked in the shadows of the Colosseum, leaned against the pillars of temples, whispered from behind tavern curtains. They fueled the city's economy, satisfied the restless desires of men from slaves to senators, and stood as the quiet backdrop to Rome's glory. Yet history books preferred marble heroes, not the women who kept the city's blood pumping in its dirtiest alleys. Day after day, their routines blurred into one another. Wake up in a sweat-soaked cell, scrape together what little food could be found, prepare for another round of strangers. Some tried to make small rituals of beauty, a dab of perfume, a curl in the hair, a string of cheap beads around the neck. But even those became reminders of the role they could never escape. Hope was rare, but it wasn't entirely absent. A handful of prostitutes bought their freedom. Some became courtesans for wealthy patrons, enjoying temporary luxury. A very few even managed to reinvent themselves as businesswomen, running taverns or bathhouses of their own. But these were exceptions. For most, the future was short and predictable. Work until the body gave out, fade into illness, disappear into the streets. No monuments, no marble epitaphs, just silence. Rome itself reinforced that silence. Official records treated prostitutes as numbers, statistics in taxation, or anonymous figures in legal decrees. Poets and satirists gave them mocking nicknames, stripping them of individuality. To the state, they were revenue. To society, they were shame. To the men who used them, they were faceless pleasure. And yet, when you stand among the ruins of Pompeii or read the graffiti scrawled into ancient walls, their voices break through. Here worked Myrtis, cheap but kind. Fabia, 2 asses, worth it. Successus loves Iris, who doesn't care. These crude scratches are the only echoes of women who are otherwise erased. They tell us that prostitutes weren't invisible. They were simply forced to exist on the margins, their lives acknowledged only in jokes, insults, or ledgers. Imagine it now. The city is quieting for the night. Fires gutter in their braziers, shadows stretch across stone streets. Somewhere in a cramped room, a woman lies awake, her body aching from the day. She listens to the distant sound of carts rattling, the laughter of drunk men, the cry of a baby from the insula above. She knows tomorrow will be the same, but she also knows she will rise because survival is the only luxury she has left, and that's the hidden story. Rome celebrated its emperors, generals and philosophers, but beneath the marble and the glory lay a vast underclass of women whose lives were written in sweat, blood and silence. They weren't just footnotes, they were the foundation. Without them, Rome's streets, taverns and homes would have looked very different. The next time you see a statue of Augustus or read about Caesar's conquests, remember that in the shadows of their world, thousands of women lived and died in ways the history books tried to forget. Their truth is ugly, raw and uncomfortable, but it's real. And without them, the Roman Empire would not have been the empire at all. If marble statues and epic poems told you everything about ancient Rome, you'd think it was a city of gods, heroes and emperors. But the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum whisper a different story. In scratched graffiti, faded frescoes and crude sketches, prostitutes appear in ways official history never wanted to record. Naked, transactional, sometimes funny, sometimes desperate. Art and graffiti were the places where their existence bled through, raw and unfiltered. Step into a Pompeian lupanar, the only fully preserved brothel in the Roman world. On the walls, above each small cell, frescoes depict acts so explicit that Victorian archaeologists locked them away in a secret cabinet for over a century. They aren't artistic in the high Roman sense. No gods, no mythological excuses, just straightforward portrayals of what services were on offer. Each painting functioned like an ancient menu, showing a client what he could expect from the woman behind the curtain. For archaeologists, they are priceless. For the women who lived under them, they were advertisements they never consented to. Graffiti carved into the plaster tells you even more. Clients scrawled reviews of their experiences, as if Yelp existed in the 1st century. Some are boastful. I screwed Novellia for 2 asses, and it was worth it. Others are cruel. Myrtis smells worse than a latrine. But sometimes, surprisingly, the words reveal tenderness. Artemitus loves Hedone. May she love him too. It's impossible to know whether Hedone was a prostitute or just a girl in the neighbourhood. But the line blurs because to many Roman men, sex and love were always transactional. The Subura district of Rome, infamous for its noise and chaos, likely had similar walls covered in graffiti, though fewer survive. What remains shows the same themes: mockery, crude humour, and anonymous desire. Prostitutes were reduced to nicknames, described by body parts or sexual acts, scratched into plaster, by men too drunk or ashamed to say it aloud. Yet these scratches are more honest than the polished histories of Livy or Tacitus. They don't celebrate empire, they celebrate flesh. Mosaics too, though rarer, reveal glimpses of sex work. In taverns and bathhouses, floor mosaics sometimes depicted erotic scenes, not with Venus or Mars, but with anonymous couples mid-act. The choice wasn't artistic grandeur, it was practical branding. Patrons walked over those mosaics on their way to rooms where real women waited, rooms where the fantasy became reality. Perhaps the most telling detail is how casual it all was. For us, preserved frescoes and graffiti are shocking, even scandalous. For Romans, it was background noise. They didn't sanitize it, they didn't hide it. The brothel wall was as much a bulletin board as a price list at a market. Prostitutes weren't glorified in official art, but they were everywhere in the unofficial kind. Rome's high art erased them, but Rome's daily scribbles couldn't help but bring them back. Imagine standing in one of those Pompeian cells. The fresco above you shows a woman on her knees, her painted smile frozen for eternity. On the wall beside you, scratch words proclaimed that someone once lay here and thought it worth recording. Outside, footsteps echo on stone as another man approaches. 2,000 years later, we're still reading the graffiti, still staring at the paintings, but the women themselves remain nameless, their real voices drowned by the scratches of their clients. In that sense, Roman prostitutes achieved a strange kind of immortality. Not the marble pedestal, not the golden laurel, but a faded fresco of their labour and a crude line of graffiti that refuses to disappear. Rome's emperors had their triumphs. These women had their walls. Rome called itself the centre of the world, and in many ways it was. Trade routes stretched from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Egypt, and wherever Roman soldiers and merchants went, women followed, some free, many enslaved, and thousands ending up in Rome's brothels. If the frescoes and graffiti gave prostitutes crude immortality, the diversity of their origins revealed another hidden truth. The sex trade was global, and Rome thrived on its imported flesh. Foreign prostitutes were marketed as exotic. Syrians, Egyptians, Gauls, Africans, Jews, Greeks. Each was branded with stereotypes, then fetishized. Syrian women were known for dance and song, Egyptian women for mystery and strange cosmetics, Gauls and Germans for their tall, pale looks. To Roman men, these women weren't individuals, but fantasies tied to empire. Buying a foreign woman meant consuming conquest. You weren't just paying for sex, you were reenacting Rome's dominance over another people. But behind the fantasy was exploitation. Most foreign prostitutes didn't choose their trade. They were enslaved captives from wars, shipped across the Mediterranean like grain or olive oil. After Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, thousands of women were sold into slavery. Some became household servants, others field labourers, and many were funneled directly into Rome's brothels. A Gaulish girl captured at 15 could find herself on a straw mattress in the Subura by 16. Her foreignness turned into a sales pitch. Racism and class shaped the trade. Roman texts often describe foreign prostitutes as cheap or animal-like. Satirists sneered that Syrian and Jewish women were overly promiscuous, that African women were wild, that Greek women were too clever for their own good. These weren't observations, they were branding strategies. clients could feel superior while indulging in the very desires society mocked. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. Rome despised these women, yet could not stop buying them. Some foreign prostitutes gained reputations that transcended the brothel. Greek heterae, educated courtesans, sometimes lived in Rome as mistresses to powerful men. They entertained not just with sex, but with conversation, poetry, and politics. But they were exceptions, rare jewels in a sea of nameless women. Most foreign prostitutes lived in the shadows, their languages and customs stripped away, their identities reduced to a label scratched on a wall: Zira, Egyptia, Graeca. And yet, their presence changed Rome itself. Exotic perfumes from Egypt, silk from the East, even certain erotic dances all entered Roman culture through brothels and taverns. What senators mocked in speeches they secretly sought after in bed. Foreign women became both despised and desired, a contradiction that Rome never solved. Imagine the scene: a Syrian woman in a dim Roman brothel, her accent still thick, her jewellery long pawned off to survive. A client enters demanding a song in her native tongue. She sings quietly, though the words are about home, not about him. He doesn't understand, and he doesn't care. To him, she is just the Syrian. To her, every note is both defiance and despair. And when she's gone, no inscription remembers her. Only stereotypes remain. Rome erased the women, but kept their exotic allure alive for centuries. They were trophies of empire, not people. And that, more than the graffiti, more than the frescoes, shows the true cruelty of the system. Rome didn't just exploit their bodies, it consumed their identities and spat them out as caricatures. When the Roman Empire was pagan, prostitution was seen as a necessary evil. It was regulated, taxed and tolerated, even as prostitutes themselves were mocked and marginalised. But when Christianity spread, everything changed. Not because prostitution vanished, but because it became charged with new layers of moral weight. What had once been a tolerated function of the city turned into the ultimate metaphor for sin. Early Christian leaders used prostitutes as examples in sermons. Augustine wrote of his youthful visits to brothels as a confession of weakness. Jerome warned Christian men that every trip to a prostitute was a step toward damnation. The figure of the prostitute became less about flesh and blood women and more about symbols, temptation, corruption, and the eternal battle between spirit and body. And yet the contradiction remained. Just as pagan Rome needed brothels, Christian Rome did too. The streets of late antiquity are still bustled with sex workers. Even as bishops condemned them, emperors kept regulating them. Laws from the 4th and 5th centuries continue to distinguish prostitutes from honourable women, proving that despite all the sermons, the trade wasn't going anywhere. What did change was perception. Under Christianity, a prostitute wasn't just dishonourable, she was spiritually polluted. Her work wasn't only shameful, it was a mark against salvation. This stigma cut deeper than before, turning already invisible women into outcasts. But Christianity also introduced paradoxical moments of redemption. Some prostitutes became saints. Mary of Egypt, for example, was said to have spent years as a prostitute in Alexandria before converting, retreating into the desert, and achieving holiness. Stories like hers weren't common, but they revealed how prostitutes had been reimagined, not simply as sinners to be despised, but as fallen women who might serve as cautionary tales or miraculous proof of divine forgiveness. Still, the lived reality was harsher. A prostitute in Christian Rome faced the same dangers as in pagan times: poverty, disease, violence, but now with the added weight of eternal damnation hanging over her head. Pagan Rome had mocked her. Christian Rome pitied and condemned her at the same time. Graffiti, frescoes, and jokes faded as Christian morality reshaped public space. The raw, open depictions of sex from Pompeii and the Subura were replaced by silence, whispers, and repression. Prostitution didn't disappear. It simply went underground. The women were still there, standing in doorways, sitting in taverns, waiting in cramped rooms. But history grew quieter about them. They slipped further into the shadows, less recorded, less remembered. And that silence is perhaps the cruelest legacy of all. Pagan Rome gave us graffiti, paintings, insults, fragments that still let us glimpse those women's lives. Christian Rome gave us sermons, allegories, and condemnations that blurred their faces entirely. The prostitute was no longer just a woman in a brothel. She became the whore of Babylon, a symbol so abstract that the real women vanished behind it. Think of it this way. The prostitutes of pagan Rome were exploited bodies. The prostitutes of Christian Rome were erased souls. Both suffered, but in different ways. One was mocked in graffiti, the other was buried in silence. And so the story ends, not with freedom, not with justice, but with disappearance. Rome's prostitutes left foreign and native, rich and poor, mocked and pitied, built lives in the margins of history, only to be remembered as shadows on walls or metaphors in sermons. They were essential to the city's survival, yet their own survival barely mattered. The empire is long gone. The frescoes fade, the graffiti crumbles, the sermons gather dust, but the women remain, not in statues or triumphal arches, but in the fragments that survived against all odds. And maybe that's the truest measure of their endurance, not glory, not sainthood, but the stubborn fact that even Rome, with all its power, couldn't erase them completely.